So let's turn to Daniel chapter. Let's actually start from Daniel chapter 5 at the end of the chapter 5. So last week I mentioned to everyone the historical fact of how Cyrus the Great, the Persian king, invaded into the Babylon, and how he actually just took down the Belshazzar, and also discussed the historical fact that how the Belshazzar was recorded in the Bible rather than his father's, which was the Nabonidus. And I actually explained that the difference between what is recorded in the human history versus what we actually see in the Bible, and there's no gap. Literally, that's what the story that I shared with you last week. However, so after Belshazzar was killed, then when you look at the chapter 5, verse 30 and 31, the very night Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius and Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So Darius is the one who actually took over the Babylon Empire, and the story begins after he actually became a king of Babylon, and that's how the chapter 6 starts. But let's just read a few a verse here before we actually start explaining the story. So let's turn to chapter 6. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for a complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for complaints or any fault, because he was a faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the preferred and the satrap, the counselor, and the governor are agree that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petitions to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions. Now, O king, established in the injunctions and signed documents so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. These, therefore, King Darius assigned the document and an injunction. When Daniel knew that the document has been signed, he went to his house, where he had windows in his upper chambers open towards the Jerusalem. He got down on his knee 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petitions and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petitions to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have assigned, but make his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and set his mind to deliver Daniel, and he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king, and said to the king, King, O kings, know, O kings, that it is a law of Medes and Persian that no injunction or ordinance that the king established cannot be changed. That can't be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, May your God whom you serve continually deliver you. And the stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den. And the king sealed it with his own signet and with his signet of his lord, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversion were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him and also before you. O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lion overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. The king, Darius, wrote to all the people, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominions people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescue. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So obviously this story is well known to many of the Christians and people who heard about the stories, especially if you actually attended the church from very young age. I mean, this is the common story that we heard about it, how great the story was, and so forth. So I don't think anybody who have not heard of this story or does not know the story of the Daniel who was rescued from the den of lions. So there are a few things we need to think about. There's not a whole lot of stuff that we need to really dig down into the story, but there are a few important things that we need to understand. First of all, when we read the story, you know, we as a Christians, when we read the story from the Bible, we really don't question anything. I mean, that's just how the Bible goes. The Bible is all, talks about the truth. So that's great. But when you look at it from the people who are not in the church or not believer, they always take the stories in the Bible and they challenge it, right? And that you see that all the time. The one of the people's been challenging for this particular story is because they simply ask one simple question: who is this Darius? So this is the big questions that many of the people's been asking. You may not have actually asked this question because you never questioned it. You never just thought about it and said, well, Darius is Darius, so nothing to really talk about. But when you think about it from the historical fact, it's a little bit different than how we understood. So let me ask these questions. Do you know who this Darius is? Does anybody know who this Darius is? Or ever heard of who? No. Is there anyone who heard about this Darius from your church or the Bible teachings and some other the people? If you did, you can share with me for what you heard. No? No one else? Okay. So when you look at it from chapter 5, right? Darius is the one who actually invaded into Babylon, the palace, and then took down the empire, entire empire. But as I mentioned from the story that I shared last week, who was the king of Persia? Yeah, the Cyrus the Great, right? The Cyrus the Great was the king of the Persia, and he's the one who invaded into Babylon, right? And then I mentioned to you about he was riding a chariot with the 4 white horses, and then one of the horses it died while he was crossing the river, and he was so upset that he just ordered his soldiers to really just pretty much put all the sand over the river to close it down. So he literally splitted the river up to almost hundreds of small pieces, and the level of the water just gone down, and then it really revealed the gate to the palace. That's how they actually got into the fortress to really destroy the Babylon, right? So we know, as Cyrus the Great is the one who actually ruling the Persia, and he was the king. But now all of a sudden the Bible is talking about Darius. So you might have heard of the name Darius, right? You may not know who actually Darius is, but you might have heard of the king named Darius. So let's talk about the Darius that you know, or the king Darius that you know. Do you know anything about the Darius? Yeah. So, as I mentioned, most of the people when we learned the ancient history, you know, if we learned in school, even if you learned, you might have forgot, because you never really paid attention, right? What we really paid attention is, oh, okay, I just want to get the, my test score, and that's it, right? And then you don't really remember exactly what the story that you read about. So Darius is actually called the King of Kings, and he was the one of the very, very famous, the king of Persia. So Darius, King of Kings, is it's a very, very well known in human history, especially in the ancient history of the Persia. But you may not know what he did, or but you will probably know one story out of all the stories that he has. But one story that is when we actually have, Olympic Games, right? Usually the last game of the Olympic is marathon, right? Marathon, everybody knows. And you heard about some history of how the marathon started, right? The Battle of Marathons, the war between the Persia and the Greeks, right? And then the Greek won in the battle at the Battle of Marathon, and the Greek ran from the battle place all the way to Athens, and then proclaimed the victory of the battle, right? And he died. And as the memorials of his, run from the battle place to the Athens, that's how the marathon started. It was included in the Olympic. That particular war was started by Darius. So now even though even though you know marathons, but you don't know exactly, how the marathon started and who was actually started this war. That was the Darius. Of course, I'm going to go over a little more details of who Darius is, but, at least one story of Darius. So, I'll share a lot more information. However, this Darius that we know, let me actually see if I can actually pull some resources here. Let me see if I can find some. Let me see. Hang on one quick second. I should have this. No, I don't have it. So let me pull this out. Okay, I think this is a good map. Okay, do you see the chart here? Okay, so this is the list of the the Persian kings list. So here you can see Cyrus the first is right here. Okay, Cyrus the first was actually the grandfather of the Cyrus the Great. The one that we know as a Cyrus is the Cyrus the second, which is the 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 Cyrus the Great. The Cyrus the second is the kings that we know who invaded into Babylon, who took over the Media, right? And then we're going to talk about all this stuff later on. But as you can see here, after Darius and his son Cambyses the second was the king after Cyrus's death, and after Cambyses the second, and after he died, the Darius the first took over the kingdom of Persia. So Darius became a king of Persia after Cyrus the second. So when you look at the years, the Cyrus the second, he started to rule the Persia, in BC 550, and then he just ruled until the 30s, and the Cambyses, ruled between 530 to 522, which is about 8 years. And then after he died, there was some other stories, which I'm going to talk about later on. But when Darius the first took over the kingdom of Persia, that was a 522, right? So there is a big gap between Cyrus the second to Darius the first. So when you look at the gap, it's about 30 years, right? So the story that we see in Daniel chapter 5 and Daniel chapter 6 is when Persia invaded into, Babylon, the story, right? So then this is when Cyrus took over the Media and also take down the Lydia, and then and then they invaded into to Babylon. So when you look at this, chapter 5, verse 31st, Darius the Medes received the kingdom being about 62 years old. If he was 62 years old, and if it's the same Darius that we know, the first, right, he wouldn't be actually, at the time when Cyrus invaded into Babylon, then he wouldn't become a king later on, 30 years later. That means if he was, let's say 62 years old and 30 years old, later, then he will become like 90 years old. He wouldn't be ruling the Persia. So therefore, what it means is that the Darius that we see in this Bible in chapter 5, it is not the same Darius that we know. It's a different Darius. Okay? And at the same time, the Darius that we know in Persian Empire, he was the king of the Persia. He was not the king of Medes. But when you look at the Bible in chapter 5, at the end, he says, Darius the Medes received the kingdom. So it's not the Persia, it's the Medes, right? So it described it a little bit different, and he was actually ruled Babylon for a few years. So now people are asking, who is this Darius then? There is no one that we know as a Darius who ruled the kingdom of Babylon. So this must be, either incorrect or this is a fabricated. So this has been a challenge for a long, long time. Even until today, obviously the historians or the scholars of the, seminary still does not know who this person is because there's no clear indication of who this person is. However, there is several different hypotheses who this person might be. So with that, and I'm going to share another information. Let me see. I don't know if you actually see a lot of material that I actually posted in the folders, but okay. You see my screen? Okay. So when you actually go to that folder that I shared, you will find this book, Darius the Mede. So this book talks about the different hypotheses. So let me just scroll down. Yeah, you see this, Darius as a historical but of uncertain identity. So people are questioning about this, the identification of this person, Darius. Is Darius the fictional character or non-fictional character? Who is he, right? So obviously, many of the histories that we know is actually, sort of a trace back to the certain historians of old time. There are two most famous historians that we reference our historical factor as Herodotus and Xenophon. Those are the Greek historians recorded the story of Babylons and the Persians and the Greeks and so forth. So we find many of the historical fact that we know or we learned from the history was the reference by their recordings. Because back then, although the Babylonians and Persian left some history of their time, but there is not enough, the historical documents that they can reference. There's pieces of information here, there, but there's nothing they can really just kind of chronicle orders and who did what. There's no, enough information for them to really find out exactly what happened. But because the Herodotus and Xenophon really left lots of informations and historical documents, so now we're going to reference their documents and believe that what really happened. But still, even until today, many people questionings about whether the accuracy of their document or is that something was written, based on their bias fact, or is it really true fact? So there's a lot of questions still. Okay? So with that fact, I'm not going to go into much of the details of history of who Herodotus is. Yeah, so right here. In chapter 3, that talks about correlation of Herodotus and Xenophon with Darius the Medes. The reason that they're talking about the Herodotus and Xenophon's the story is because they kind of reference a little bit different. Their story does not really exactly matching. Okay, so that's why there's a discrepancy between the two, and who is right and who really documents the correct information is really unknown because there's no other things that we can really reference it. So when you look at their story, so the first hypothesis is this. Let me see if I can find the sections. Even after let me see. Hang on one second. Let me just open this up again. Where's the book again? And so first of all, so there's a multiple different hypothesis, as I mentioned. Darius as Cyaxares II, Darius as Gubaru, Darius as Cyrus, and there are a few other hypotheses who this Darius is. So when you scroll down here, where is it? Right here. So the first hypothesis was Darius as Cyaxares II. Cyaxares is one of the king. So among early Christians and Jewish commentators on Daniel, Josephus and Jerome were the most influential for later church history. The Josephus and earlier of the two sources write, now Darius had put an end to the dominions of the Babylonian with Cyrus, his relative, being 62 years old when he took Babylon, who was the son of Astyages, who was called another name among the Greeks. What it means is that the Astyages, which was the Cyrus, the grandfather, right? He was the king of Medes, and Astyages wanted to kill Cyrus when he was born, which I explained to you last week, right? And then, he ordered to really just to kill his grandson, but obviously because of the long story, he was spared, and he was able to really just took over his grandfather's the kingdom. But they believed that Astyages had another son besides Mandanis, which was daughter, which was the Cyrus's mother. So many believes that the Darius was his uncle, which was Astyages' son. So, but he was actually called to be a called to have a different name, which was the Darius. But in historical fact, his name is recorded as Cyaxares II. And Xenophon is the only Greek historian who is known to refer to a son of Astyages, and his works were read widely in antiquities. Although Josephus does not explicitly refer to Xenophon, it appears to identify Daniel's Darius, the Medes, with Xenophon's Cyaxares II. Next to Josephus, the most important ancient commentator to express the view on Darius the Medes is Jerome, who wrote as follows. The Archer's translation, after he had been killed by Darius, king of Medes, who was the maternal uncle of Cyrus, the king of Persia. The empire of the Chaldean was destroyed by Cyrus the Persian. It was these two kingdoms, the Medians and the Persian, which Isaiah in chapter 21 addressed as a charioteer of the vehicle drawn by the camel and an ass. Indeed, Xenophon also writes the same thing in connection with the childhood of Cyrus the Great. Likewise, Pompeius, Trogus, and many others who have written up the history of the barbarians. Some authorities think that this Darius was Astyages mentioned in the Greek writing, while others think it was Astyages' son, and that he was called by the other name among the barbarians. So this is the one of the strong beliefs that Darius was the uncle of Cyrus the Great. And he only ruled the Babylon Empire after Cyrus the Great actually took over the kingdom of Babylon. So he was there to rule as just, a temporary king until he was actually just working on some other matters. All right? So Darius only ruled the Babylon for a very short period of time. According to our story, he probably ruled the Babylon for maybe 2 years before he retired. And there's also another hypothesis that many people also believe that this Darius is a Cyrus himself. It was just to reference it as a different name, right? So some believes that it is just that Darius was the different name of Cyrus. And also, another hypothesis is Darius is a Cyrus. The second proposal to reconcile Daniel's account with Herodotus and identify Darius as none other than Cyrus himself. So there's another hypothesis. Another hypothesis, minor proposal, which is Darius was one of the officials of the Persian Empire who really supported the Cyrus. And his name was, as I mentioned, I'm not going to go too much details, but when we actually go back to the index part, so you can see this is Gubaru, or there's also Gorbaeus. So there's two other candidates that are in the part of those hypothesis story. So if you're interested to know more about the story of Darius, you can certainly reference this this book, which I uploaded in the folders. You can just read about it at your leisure time to understand more about the story of Darius. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but at least you understand there's some historical fact versus what is written in the Bible, who's the Darius, and so forth. There's a lot of people questioning. But as I mentioned before, the human histories, unfortunately, has never been written the way that it really occurred, right? It has always been altered, manipulated, to really just to promote their, their work, or sometimes has been changed for their benefit. So our even history is really not something that we can rely on either. And I also mentioned that many things that we actually have in a historical fact, later find out that they're actually, those things are wrong, right? And this is why I told you before that many of the historians never neglect the importance of the Bible itself, because there has been so many different, the historical fact that they didn't believe the Bible is the factual, but later on they found the different the historical fact that indeed the Bible was correct and our assumption was wrong, right? So this is why they never really just exclude the Bible as the reference point of the historical, the artifact. So I just want to just mention to you guys so that you have a good understanding, when people asking who is this Darius, so that you have a better understanding. But in our church, we really don't explain to the people, or never ask those questions, never really just talk about these things, but we just simply believed as it is written in the Bible, because we don't really question the Bible. But the problem is when someone else, which is a non-believer, when you actually have a conversation, when they question this, you don't know what to say, because that's what it says up in the Bible, but they say something completely different. Then you have nothing to say, because you have no background of exactly what happened. This is why we have to understand not only what's in the Bible, but also be able to compare it against the historical factors, so that how we be able to prepare to really answer, or if anyone, either kids or the other adults asking those questions, you are much more equipped to really explain and, share those informations and what is really happening, and how we can really describe and explain the story of the Darius. And not only just the story of the Darius, but all other historical fact that really occurred. Because in secular world, we don't teach Bible, right? We just teach the science and history. But when you really just think about it, there's a lot of discrepancy between what is written in the Bible versus what the world is teaching. So you need to be able to understand both sides and be able to really explain what the difference is and how to really reconcile between the two. All right? So I'm not going to, this is not a historical class, so I'm not going to go too much detail into the story, but I just want to share some important story with you so that you have a better understanding. So let's just come back to Daniel again in chapter 6. So assuming whoever this the person Darius is, but at least this is not the same Darius, the King of Kings, or the Darius the first that we know in the Persian history. It's a different person, okay? Now, Darius, when he took over the kingdom of Babylon at the time, and obviously he actually appointed 120 satraps, and also he put 3 high officials, and Daniel was one of them, right? So under Darius, there's 3 high officials, and there are about 120 satraps under the high officials to control the kingdom. When he did that, people weren't too happy, because Daniel was in a very, very high position at the time. And as you know, if you ever work for big organizations or any government, people jealous about other people's success, right? And they try to find the faults in them so they can actually just take them down. And we hear that stories, even today's political news that we hear, right? In ancient days, no different. So they weren't too happy that Daniel was taking the very high position. So they try to find the flaws and the falsehood of Daniel. So they look at every opportunity to say, what is he doing wrong? And how could we really just complain about him? But no matter what they looked at, he has no faults. I don't know how he did it, but I guess that he was actually, there's a man of a faults, no faults that they could not really identify. So what they did was, we need to find some way to really trap him. Since we cannot find any falsehood of the Daniel, so only thing that we can really just complain about him is his religious belief, right? He was a man of a faith, and he was never given up his own faith. So he always prayed in his house that he opened the window towards the Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day. So what the officials and the satrap gathered, and they kind of like plotted to really trap him. The one way they did was, okay, they went to Darius and say, the king, we should, we as the Babylons and the people who are actually in these countries, we should just only give the homage to you, because you're like you're the king, and you're like a god for us. So why don't you just proclaim to the nations that for a whole month, no one bow down to any man, any god, but only to you, so that we give all our homage to you. And Darius, without knowing their plot, he agreed. But the problem is, once in the ancient day, especially in Persia, when they stamp on with their signet, even king who actually ordered to do so cannot even change it. And you see the same story in Esther. Remember the story of the Esthers, that they actually, they tried to kill all the Jews, and they ordered really just not to fight with the Xerxes was ordered or agreed to really just to kill the Jews. He couldn't even change it. So later on, what he did was he ordered the Jews to fight back. Right? That's the only thing he can do. He could not cancel out. He could not really just say, well, I withdraw this order. He can't do that. So same things. They knew that even king cannot change whatever injunctions that they put on. So they used that as, to really trap Daniel. So Darius agreed, and he put the stamp on with his the signet rings, because he bowed down to his God 3 times a day. So when you go back to chapter 6 and verse 9 and on, therefore Darius signet the document and injunction. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open towards Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. So even though it's not like he did not know that Darius stamped on this, on the document, he knew. Even though he knew that he stamped on this document, that, if he bowed down to the God that he has been worshiping, then he's going to get killed. But he didn't mind, which means even if he, kills me, I still do what I do. So this story is very similar to the 3 other friends of Daniel when they were thrown into the fire, right? they said, even if God does not save us, we will not worship or we will not bow down to this, the idols. So he really took the same position, and he didn't care what the document says. I still do what I do. This is how I actually show my respect and homage to my God. So he just went to the upper chamber and he opened the windows towards the Jerusalem and he bowed down, just like how he's been doing for all these times. He didn't change anything. So you can see how faithful he was, that he really just never given up his faith for these orders that Darius actually put on. When you look at the Psalm chapter 55, let's go to Psalm chapter 55. This is what King David said. We're going to read from verse 1. Give ear to my prayer, O God, and hide not yourself from my plea for mercy. Attend to me and answer me. I'm restless in my complaint, and I moan, because of the noise of the enemy, because of the oppressions of the wicked. For they drop trouble upon me, and in angers they bear a grudge against me. My heart is in anguish within me. The terror of death have fallen upon me. Fear and trembling come upon me, and horror overwhelm me. And I say, oh, that I had wings like a dove, I would fly away and be at rest. Yet I would wander far away, I would lodge in the wilderness. I would hurry to find a shelter from the raging wind and tempest. Destroy, O Lord, divide their tongues, for I see violence and strife in the city. Day and night they go around it on its walls, and iniquity and trouble are within it. Ruin is in its midst. Oppressions and fraud do not depart from its marketplace. For it is not an enemy who taunt me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolently with me. Then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, a familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together. Within God's house we walked in the throne. Let death steal over them. Let them go down to Sheol alive, for evil is in their dwelling place and in their hearts. But I call to God, and the Lord will save me. Evening and morning, at noon, I utter my complaint and moan, and he hears my voice. He redeems my soul in safety from the battle that I wage, for many are arrayed against me. God will give ears and humble them, he who is enthroned from an old, because they do not change and do not fear God. My companion stretched out his hand against his friends. He violated his covenant. His speech was smooth as butter, yet war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet they were drawn swords. Cast your burden on the Lord, and he will sustain you. You will never permit the righteous to be moved, but you, O God, will cast them down into the pit of destructions. Men of blood and treachery shall not live our half their days, but I will trust in you. When you read this Psalm chapter 55, it's like the story of a Daniel, right? Exactly what he did, right? Even though his enemy was trying to trap him and try to kill him, and literally their plan is to eliminate Daniel from the the control. So they plotted this to try to kill him, but Daniel did not care because he trusted the Lord that he will protect. So therefore, he prayed when? He prayed evening, morning, and noon. Just like he used to do. No difference at all. So he kneeled down, he opened the doors, he actually bowed down before the Lord, and then he just prayed, just like how he's been doing for all these times. So he never budged, literally, and he just did what he did. So, therefore, they saw and literally trapped him the way they plotted, right? So, I see that he's still doing what he actually is doing, and we knew that he's going to do it anyway because he's never given up doing this. So they just went to the king, Darius, and reported to him, and they say, hey, you actually stamped on a document that no one can bow down before man or any god other than you. But Daniel had actually bowed down, so he should be punished and he should be, executed the way you said. And then Darius, when you look at the, book of Daniel here, verse 16 says, then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. Because now you can see that how Darius felt and how really he cared for Daniel. He didn't want Daniel to die. But because of his order, because of the way he was the document was stamped on, he could not change. So he had to be actually brought down to the den of lions. So he couldn't do anything, even though he really cared and he was hoping and he was wishing that he doesn't die. And then verse 16 says, verse 17 says, and stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, and nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. So, which means he stayed all night. He couldn't sleep at all because he cared for Daniel. He worried about what happened to Daniel. So that shows how much he really cared. I mean, think about it. Darius is the king of Babylon, the entire land of Babylon. Why would he actually care so much about Daniel? Daniel is just one of the captives from Judah, and he's very old, right? At his age, he's very old. But he really did care. But he had no control, but he had to be actually sent to the den of lions. He couldn't sleep at all. And the verse 19 says, then a break of day, so the soonest the day started, he ran. Right? The king rose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish, and king declared to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? When you look at this, he seemed to have a man of a faith. Right? Doesn't he have a faith? Daniel was thrown into the den of lions. He would have been killed as soon as he was lowered down to the den of lions. He would have been eaten up and break their bone, right? But even though he just went there, the day after, he was still asking, Daniel, are you still there? Right? He seemed to have a really faith. He's a faith is better than the people of Judah. And Daniel responded and said, Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel to taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions. They, their children, and their wives, and before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Some of the scholars or some of the people say, Daniel was not eaten up because the lions were full. So I don't know if you ever seen the how the lions do when they're full, when their stomach is full. They don't really do anything. Even if there's a little animals just passing by in front of the lions, they don't do anything because they're full, right? They don't touch. So many people said the reason the Daniel was not eaten up because they were full. No, that's not true. If they're full, they would not eaten up their enemies, right? So we can see, what a lot of people believe that it wasn't really God who really shut their mouth, or it would not allow the lions to eat Daniel. That's not true. But so he was a spare. He was, the lion did not attack Daniel, and he was, he found with no harm, and he was drawn out of the den of lions, and it was certainly a surprise that Darius saw that Daniel was untouched. So this is where the kids are clapping. This, yeah, Daniel was spared. Yeah, he's alive. So I learned the stories when I was young with the pictures, when, of course, that Daniel was standing in front of a lot of the lions, and, of course, that's how we all learn, right? So this is a great story to really just to tell. And then continue on and says, verse 25 and on, the king Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and language that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So as you can see here, at the end of the verse 28, it said, the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. So this literally tells us this is not Cyrus the Great, because Darius and the Cyrus the Great, right? So this really tells us this is not the same person. It's a different person. So as you can see, there are a lot of the suspicions people have. Oh, Darius must be the Cyrus, a different name. That's not true, right? But what's interesting here is that when you look at the message that Darius had delivered to the people of the Babylon, is that he is praising about the Lord that Daniel believes, right? As if it's like confession of a man of faith. Just like the Nebuchadnezzar, when he saw the wonders of the Lord, that he actually spared the three, friends of the Daniel, right? And then he confessed that, well, he's the really, the God of God, and he's the really just the living God, and so forth. He just wrote about the whole praise about the God of Israel. And Darius did the exactly same thing. This confession is much better than the people who live in Judah, or the people who actually just, came to Babylon as a captivity. His actually confession was actually like almost, the true confession of the believers. But remember, he is from Persia, and he's from Medes. They have their own God. So Persians and the people of Medes believed in many different gods. And one of the important god that they believe is Ahura Mazda. You know the car, the manufacturer Mazda, right? The car, the Mazda. That Mazda literally came from that. The Ahura Mazda is the god that Persian believed. And they believed that the Ahura Mazda as their god to worship them. So Darius, just like the Nebuchadnezzar, he was not a believer of the Lord, of the God of Hebrews, but he praised about the wonders and the miracles that he has seen. So this story, as we know, it is a very, very common story for all of us to know. So what other story can we learn from this? But now what I want you to do is, I want you to pull yourself out of the story for a moment. Okay? Now, I want you to just fly as high as, it's at 30,000 feet away from the ground, just like the birds, it sees the ground or earth. Okay? Now I want you to pull yourself out of the scenes, and I want you to look at it from the far, far distance to see what you see in this story. What do you see in this story? So remember I mentioned to you that you need to be able to see the story from, like micro view. And at the same time, you need to be able to see things from the macro view, right? So instead of looking at this incident so closely, I want you to pull yourself out of that, and then from the far distance to see what this story is about. Well, obviously, since you never flew, just like the bird, you can't tell what you see on the earth, right? So now I have to say to the new generations, like, look at it from the drone's perspective, drone camera, right? Instead of the bird eyes, now we have to talk about like drone's eye, right? What do you see in the camera? So think about this. When you look at the stories from the far distance, okay, we're going to try to map this into the story that we know. I want you to put Daniel as a Jesus, Darius as the king of the story, and the enemy is jealous and doesn't like Daniel, so they want to kill Daniel. The purpose of this, the enemy of Daniel, their purpose is to how to kill Daniel, to remove him, right? So they set the trap, try to kill Daniel. So they try to find the sin of Daniel, right? So they plotted, because the king is the one who rules, and he actually stamped on the law that he cannot change himself, which is the sinner must be punished. You cannot change. Because you're righteous, God, you cannot change. And they say, I will forgive it. It doesn't work that way. So Daniel was put into traps, and he was actually thrown into the den of lions, which means when you're thrown into the den of lions, you get killed. So you're thrown into the death. But death cannot overcome Daniel because he is the man of no fault. The lions could not kill him because he was a righteous man, right? So death could not overcome him, and therefore he was thrown up from the den of lions. It's like death and the resurrection, right? And later on, the people who trapped Daniel, try to kill Daniel, was thrown into the den of lions, get killed. Do you see the story of Jesus Christ? When you look at it from the far distance, and when you look at the whole story, not from the story of a Daniel, he was thrown into the den of lions, but when you really map the story towards the Jesus, that's exactly the same story. The king could not sleep because he was anxious. He was trying to just save, right? And king knows he has no fault, but he had to throw Daniel into the den of lions because he had no choice. Because he himself could not change the law. So when you look at it from the far distance, this story is not about Daniel being saved from the den of lions, but this is the story of a Jesus. How he was actually set as a trap, and he was a righteous man, he still was able to, he was actually thrown into the death, but the death could not overcome, and he was thrown up, which is the resurrection. Death and resurrection. So, when you look at the story, this is not about Daniel. This is about Jesus. The story that we have to learn from this, and not only the story, same thing with the three friends of Daniel. That's exactly the same story. That's about the story of, the Jesus as well. It just referenced it a different way, but when you look at it from the far distance, it's the same exact story. Do you see the same stories from the book of Daniel now? But the problem is we don't see those because when we learn the story, when we heard of the story, we always focus on Daniel. Because this is something we need to really just kind of pull us away from it because that's what we've been focusing on. We really miss the really important story that God is trying to relate to us. We don't see that because that's not how we learned. But we need to be able to see things, from different perspective, what this story is really telling us. Right? Remember, I mentioned to everyone when we started this Bible sharing that what is this Bible is about? Bible is about Jesus. Remember when I actually showed you from the book of Mark, right, at the end? No, not book of Mark, I'm sorry, the Luke. So, I'm going to read from book of Luke chapter 24, verse 44. It says, this is what Jesus said, "There are many words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything written about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled." That's exactly what Jesus said. What you see in the Old Testament, everything what you read, everything what you knew about the Old Testament is about me. Who I am, what I will do, that has to be fulfilled. So what we learn from book of Daniel, about the three friends of Daniel, and about Daniel, is not about Daniel or those three friends. They were used as just a metaphor to represent Jesus and what he will do. So that's the kind of story that we need to really focus on. So everything what you read in the Bible, don't read as, oh, it's the story of a Daniel. Oh, story of Abraham. Oh, story of a King David. As I mentioned, yes, they were used in the story, but at the same time, you have to be able to see the true story behind it. This is why I mentioned that when we actually read a story of a fable, right, we're not really reading the story itself, but the teachings from that fable and what the writer was trying to teach us through that particular story, right? Now, that's what we need to see. Bible is not trying to teach us the history. Bible is not teaching us any particular characters, but rather, the Bible is teaching us who Jesus is and what he will do. So hopefully now you get to see the story of Daniel. And at the end, as I mentioned, what Darius, the king, mentioned is that he prays about the Lord, which is the true God and who he is. This is the praise at the end you give. All right. With that, we're going to turn to chapter 7. Obviously, I won't be able to cover entire chapter 7 today, and I'm going to just kind of cover some story of the chapter 7. But this chapter 7 has a very interesting fact. As I mentioned about the book of Daniel, you probably realize that actually I, kind of try to tie the human history, with the story of the Bible, right? The Daniel has a lot of, connections with the human history because he described the things that he never seen or experienced because he died before, he has seen. Only thing that he has seen was the rulings of the Babylon, as well as when Persian really took over the Babylon Empire, and what happened at the very beginning. He saw it, but the rest of the historical fact that he didn't see. But he described all of those. So I'm going to talk a lot more history, but even though you don't have a good understanding of all the historical fact, but I still going to just summarize some of the historical fact and so that you get to understand better. But it is definitely helpful for you to really just to read about some of the historical fact which I posted in the folders. All right. So let's just read the chapter 7 for a moment. In the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon, Daniel saw a dream and vision of his head as he lay in his bed. Then he wrote down the dream and told the sum of the matter. Daniel declared, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of heaven were stirring up the great sea, and four great beasts came up out of the sea, different from one another. The first was like a lion, and had eagle's wing. Then, as I looked, its wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man. Then the mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And it was told, Arise, devour much flesh. After this, I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with 4 wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had 4 heads, and dominion was given to it. After this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a 4th beast, terrifying and dreadful, and exceedingly strong. It had a great iron teeth. It devoured and broke it pieces, and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horn, and behold, there came up among them another horn, a little one, before which 3 of the first horn were plucked up by the roots. And behold, in this horn were eyes like the eyes of a man, and the mouth speaks great things. All right. So Belshazzar, in the first year of Belshazzar, which is the BC 553. So this dream, or the visions that Daniel has saw, was when Belshazzar became a king. So as I mentioned, Belshazzar did not really become a king because the last king of Babylon was Nabonidus, as I mentioned, right? But he was the second in command because he was literally just ruling the Babylon Empire while his father was away. So let's go back to the let's see if I can pull this up again. Let me share my screen. Yeah, you remember this, the chart, which is the kings of Babylon Empire, the Neo-Babylon Empire. So Nabopolassar was the father of Nebuchadnezzar, right? So they were kind of like, they're the one who actually established the basis or the foundation of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Of course, the Babylonian Empire existed way, way before, because you go back to the Genesis, the Babylonian Empire started, but before they didn't call it Babylonian Empire. As a matter of fact, there's some history says the Babylonian Empire, but really empire starts from Persian Empire, not really Babylonian Empire. But anyway, after death of Nebuchadnezzar, evil Merodach is the king who actually ruled after Nebuchadnezzar. And evil Merodach, ruled for almost just 2 years, from BC 562 to 560, and then the Neriglissar ruled the kingdom between 560 to 556, which is only literally 4 years. And then his son, which is Labash Marduk, took over, but literally Nabonidus didn't like it. So he literally Labash Marduk literally, ruled for maybe 2 months. So he was just, he became a king, and then he was literally assassinated by the Nabonidus. So that was when Nabonidus became a king in BC 556, as you can see here, the Belshazzar started to rule BC 553, which is 3 years later, when Nabonidus took over the kingdom of Babylon, right? So, as you can see here, Nabonidus really was not a really politician. He had other interests than ruling the Babylonian Empire. But Belshazzar, on the other hand, he had a more ambitious heart, and he really wanted to become really king. So many times, Nabonidus didn't really control, he didn't really just do much, so he was away from the capital, right? Ecbatana. So while he was away, he was not really controlling the Babylon Empire. Belshazzar was really just a kind of ruling on behalf of his father Nabonidus. So the first year of Belshazzar, it was started to ruling the empire, which is back in BC 553, until the fall of the Babylon, which was 539. So as I mentioned, the story, chapter 7, is when Belshazzar started to ruling the empire, which was BC 553. So now, when you look at the chapter 7, now you're going back, because chapter 5 and chapter 6 was, talking about the fall of the Babylon, right, which is a BC 539. So now you're going back almost, almost 14 years back, right? So kind of like, going back to the history, and then we talk about the dream and vision that Daniel has, right? Because chapter 6 was talking about when, the Darius was already became a king of Babylon, right? So that happened, 538. So now we're going back to the 14 years back and the dream that Daniel. So, when the Cyrus the Great came to Babylon, it was Media as well as the Persia, right? So it was a Media plus the Persia who literally destroyed the Babylon. Those two wings that they saw from the lion was Media and Persia. Because when the Babylon was ruling, those two countries was under the control of Babylon. But now it got pulled, the wings were plucked off, because eventually Media and Persia is the one who destroyed the Babylon. So then it says, it was, going back to verse 4, the first was like a lion and had eagle's wing. Then as I looked, the wings were plucked off, and it was lifted up from the ground and made to stand on 2 feet like a man, and mind of a man was given to it. And behold, another beast. So another beast that came up, and what that beast is this time is literally the second one like a bear. It was raised up on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh. So this time, he has seen the second beast that came up after the first beast from the one corner, which was the lion. This time, he see another beast coming up from different corner, and this is the bear. When you look at the comparison between the beast he saw, the first, which was a lion, compared to bear. Bear is much bigger than lion, right? He's much bigger because the Persian Empire is much, much bigger than Babylon Empire. So it is referenced as the Persia who actually took over the land of the Babylons and expanded. So this bear was a big and raised up one side. It had 3 ribs in his mouth between his teeth. So he's biting something on his teeth under this bear. The three ribs he was actually holding on, and this ribs is literally Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. So this beast is holding and biting up these 3 ribs on his teeth, which is Babylon, Lydia, and Egypt. But after verse 5. And behold, another beast, a second one is like a bear. It was raised up on one side, and it had the three ribs in its mouth between its teeth, and it was told, arise, devour much flesh, which means after Persian took over the Babylon, he did not stay in one regions, but he continued to expand. So he really destroyed a lot more people than Babylon did. So he eaten up a lot of flesh. After this, I looked, and behold, another like a leopard, with the four wings of a bird on its back. And the beast had four heads. Dominion was given to it. So now the third beast that he saw was the leopard. Leopard now this time has four wings. So leopard represent Greek, which is Alexander the Great, who destroyed the Persian Empire. But when you think about it, Alexander the Great was to swiftly conquer the regions, the bigger than what the Persian did. And he was just sweeping through the whole land of the Europe to the Middle East, and even close to the border of the India, right? So this leopard represent the Greek, which is the Greek took over the Persian Empire. But why does this Greek has the four wings? Because after the death of Alexander the Great, there was the battle between the generals who supported Alexander the Great, and they divided all this land after the death of the Alexander, which I'm going to go too much detail in this lesson, but after death of Alexander's son was too young to rule the Greek Empire. So the generals, they kind of divided the land, and they started to rule the chunks of the land. And later, when the Alexander the Great's son, he grows up, then they were going to return the country back to him. But eventually, that's not what happened. Literally, just the Alexander's son got killed, and his wife was also get killed. But anyway, after the many, the battle between those many generals, and later on, the land was divided into the four different generals, which I'm going to talk about the Greek history later on. But now after death of Alexander the Great, now the country is divided into four different land. That's why it has the four wings of this leopard. So this leopard represents the Greek Empire, and with the four generals later on who ruled the different regions. And then, verse 7, after this I saw in the night vision, and behold, a fourth beast, terrifying and dreadful and exceedingly strong. It had great iron teeth. It devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I considered the horn, and behold, then came up among them another horn, a little ones, before which 3 of the first horn were plucked off by the roots. And behold, in this horn were like eyes of man, and the mouth of a speak great things. So obviously, this unknown beast could not even describe what this beast is about, because the first one was the lion, second one was a bear, the third one was a leopard, but the fourth beast, he could not even describe what it is. It was just like, it's just unknown animal, but it is a very strong, and it's a very terrifying and dreadful and strong beast. obviously this beast represent Roman Empire. All right. So this is the same one as the one that Nebuchadnezzar has seen, with the big statue with the gold and silvers and bronze and the irons and iron with the clay. So those things that Nebuchadnezzar has seen is exactly what the Daniel has seen. Well, unfortunately, we just don't have enough time to really go over the Roman Empire, but you can see what those beasts means and what that represent. So I'm going to really just to continue to explain more about the stories, continue on next week. So why don't we just wrap this up, today here, and I will explain more as we go along. So at this point,